Oh, good, some response. I was all worried. Guess you guys already went across this hall there and visited our lounge. We've got a nice high octane bar, so feel free to get some coffee and the Breakfast of Champions, donuts, of course. Welcome to CI&T. Welcome to our program that we put together for you today. We hope you enjoy it and you dip in and out and check out all of our panels. We've got a lot of great talks lined up throughout the day for you guys. We've got machine learning Coca-Cola later, some fintech frontlines, and today we're going to kick it off with a nice feel-good talking about next gen and social good. So without further ado, I will let our panelists come on up and take it away. Thank you.
Hey, can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Perfect. All right, welcome today. We're super excited to be here talking about next-gen technology and how we're using that for social good. I got my colleagues here, Bennett Wetch from Fair Trade Certified, Sarah Potts from Thorn, and Killian Moote from Humanity United. And we're going to kick it off really just talking about, one, I want to see a show of hands here. Who is from a nonprofit or mission-based organization? Awesome, awesome. So all the folks we've got up on stage here are using different kinds of technologies, blockchain, AI, new systems to further their missions. So the first question I have for you all today is how are you guys seeing some of these technologies impact social good, and how are you all using it at your groups?
I'll jump in, start here. Yeah, so I work for Humanity United. We're a private foundation that is addressing some of the most intractable social problems in the world. One of those issues that we've been committed to for the past decade is human trafficking, forced labor issues. So a lot of our utilization of technology is trying to specifically address that issue. We as an organization look at technology as a tool, right? So as a social change agency, we say, how might we use this tool like any other tool to further our mission? And I think that's really important context for the work that we do, because sometimes I think as a technologist, we might think, well, tech is the solution. And what our frame is how might tech enable us to have a greater impact on the issues we care about. So some of the ways that we've done that at Humanity United is, one, I oversee a project called Know the Chain, which we've had the privilege of working with Comrade and CI&T on, where we're trying to take big data set, publicly available information, analyze that effectively, provide it back to investors on what companies are doing that they own to address labor issues in supply chains, with the underlying thesis that if you don't address labor inequality, that actually can hurt your investment. So what we have to do then is we primarily are using people to do that analysis. It's quite big data analyst team, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve by using technology. So whether it's machine learning or just better data collection processes to make it more effective and efficient for us as an organization to empower the investors that we are engaging with so that they can then put pressure on the companies to address these labor inequalities. And then other things that we're doing is looking at investments into blockchain, the promise of blockchain, which really it is very much still a promise in our minds, that might encourage ways to have better supply chain tracing, understand your supply chain better. The more you know what your supply chain looks like, there's a greater likelihood that you can address labor inequality issues that might be occurring unbeknownst to you as a company or unbeknownst to you as an investor.
Yeah, at Fair Trade, our mission is really similar in terms of supply chain sustainability and resiliency. But coming from the nonprofit side, when it comes to adopting next-gen tech, it's much more of an organizational and culture change than it is about the technology itself in order to get us there. So having been around for 20 years, it took some convincing for senior management and the board to want to invest in our internal capacity to be able to leverage these types of tools, to bring on engineers and designers and product owners. And so as we're looking at adopting things like artificial intelligence to better inform supply chain management and supply chain resiliency, or as we look at more Internet of Things and getting sensors embedded in farms, factories, and fisheries around the world to ensure better management and better knowledge flow across supply chains, the big task for me and for our organization right now is let's put the infrastructure in place that ensures that no matter what the next gen tech is that we want to adopt, we have the infrastructure to do so, versus the opposite direction of, okay, let's just choose something like blockchain go hire a blockchain developer, build something, and then figure out what we want to do with it.
And at Thorn, what we do is we build technology to defend children from sexual abuse. And so our whole mission is like predicated upon the fact that technology has made it easier to access and abuse children. And we've been around for 5 years. And so what that means is like the opposite of your 20-year problem, right? Like we hit the ground running with all the technologies that were available 5 years ago, and believe similarly to Humanity United that technology is just a tool. And what that tool does is tools create and aggravate existing power imbalances. And the existing power imbalances for our children and for the most vulnerable in our community is that they're more susceptible to be taken advantage of. And for example, we see with human trafficking situations, domestic minor sex trafficking is the like big term for that. We see that there's over 150,000 escort ads posted every day, and inside of those ads are children. And so what are we gonna do to help use technology, the latest and greatest, whatever machine learning, whatever semantic analysis, whatever linguistics that we have, to help identify where in all of those ads are our children and how can we get to them faster. So we're really interested in looking at the ways that technology has already been used to accelerate exploitation and match that speed, and then hopefully in the next couple of years, like overcome that so that we are not just playing catch up to the people who are using our greatest ideas, but by bringing in the smartest people that we have working closely with Comrade, working closely with a lot of wonderful organizations to be able to say, here's what we're going to do to prevent this type of abuse moving forward.
And how would you guys think that technology now has to be a part of the fabric of the organization and not just an afterthought, kind of as you were saying? Sarah, you're saying it's part of the 5 years that you've been around. Bennett, you're saying 20 years, and now we're starting to add these things. To what extent do you think that next-gen technology really needs to be brought into the conversation, first and foremost?
Yeah, from my perspective, business strategy and technology strategy have to go hand in hand. You can't have a technology strategy and then develop a business strategy out of it, and vice versa. You can't develop a business strategy and then figure out, okay, what technology solution do we want to slap on top of that? And so that's been, again, a big culture change and a big shift for internal capacity and for the mindset of our board and our senior leadership team, is thinking about, okay, if we want to embark on this initiative, let's think about the technology that would support it or be the foundation for that, hand in hand as we're thinking about these new initiatives.
Yeah.
Ben, I really like what you were saying earlier about how you're building the infrastructure as an organization to then say, how might we leverage technology? I was part of an organization previously where we were trying to catch up to the next tech fad, right? And so mobile came out, and there was this idea of we could scan products and we can give that information back. So we put all this energy and time, even though we weren't really adequately positioned as a tech-enabled organization, to build a mobile phone app because we thought that was a thing that we needed to do because everybody's talking about doing it, without taking a step back first and say, how does this investment that we're making as an organization going to further our mission? I think that's a really important thing as an NGO to consider, because you only have a finite amount of resources, right? You just inherently. So any kind of decision you're making that is intended to enable you as an organization, I think you have to come back to that point that you made, which is how are we building the infrastructure as an organization to allow for us to adopt the next gen tech? Because there's always going to be the next mobile phone app. There's always going to be the next blockchain. And if you're only responding to the fad and not thinking about how that helps you in the future, then you're going to constantly be playing this game of catch up, and you're not going to be effective as an organization.
And as you're going and your new technologies are expanding on existing realities for the vast majority of the time. So when you're trying to figure out what that next technology is, it's less about what that new technology is and more about what is your goal and what is your purpose, and how are those technologies going to facilitate and exponentially increase your ability to achieve your goal. So if what we're trying to do is find kids, and we're trying to use facial recognition to find kids on the streets of Oakland, we don't need to have the perfect facial recognition. We don't need to adopt it completely. It just needs to work a lot better than scrolling through the internet. And so there's a lot of opportunity to take technologies that are working at scale in huge ways and apply them to your problem and still see incredible results quickly because you've applied technology to an area that wasn't looked at before. And I think there's a huge amount of power in being able to do, in finding new overlaps for them.
So what are some of the strategies, the tactics that you guys use to kind of think about, hey, if there's a new technology that I'm seeing coming into the market, how do you, mesh that with the mission that you guys have and think about, okay, is this going to work for me or not? And then make the case maybe to senior management or whoever else you need to within the organization that, hey, we really need to think about this as getting ahead of the curve right before we're behind the ball off of it?
I think this is a place where Thorn will be a little bit different than the other two answers, which is that like I'm always getting like a text from my boss being like, hey, did you hear about this? Why aren't we doing this? Like, so when we have a full in-house technical team that's always like analyzing new ways that technology is being used. And so for us, our whole, I'm gonna like answer by not answering, like our whole culture is about like trying to find out what's new and trying to say what is our role there and how do we, and is that a place for us specifically where children are vulnerable and how are we going to get to that space to protect children first and create the paradigm where protecting children in new technology spaces is normal. So I think the culture is really strong there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, for us, we work in around 50 countries, multiple languages, supply chains from coffee to cocoa to seafood to this Patagonia shirt that I'm wearing. And so as we're looking to adopt technologies, we have to identify, can this cover our entire portfolio? Is this something that could work in a factory in Bangladesh as well as a coffee farm in Colombia? If so, then that helps our general sense of scale. But that also doesn't mean that we don't pursue other more specific solutions because all supply chains are different and factory workers inherently face different challenges than fishers do. And so one of the things that we look at is, one, can this help advance our mission to scale our impact? There are almost 2 billion people on the planet that earn less than $2 per day working in agriculture. Our hope is that we can impact those people and improve their community resiliency and their livelihoods, but we have to be, as a nonprofit with limited resources, we have to be very targeted in terms of aiming ahead of the curve so that we don't fall behind, and then making. It's as important for us to figure out what to say no to as it is what to say yes to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Just thinking through how to respond to this question, tactically, I think it's really important to try and build up, if you're a nonprofit, build up strong external partners that you might be able to pilot ideas with. So for example, I've worked with a university previously that had programmers. So I might bring a big question to them that says, how might I use machine learning to further what I do, right? And they might be able to then run a pilot for me that then I can turn around and come to Comrade or come to CI&T and say, hey, we did this effective pilot. It proved some results. It validated that we could use this technology. How might we work with you to then help us scale that? And then turn around to a funder and say, we did this pilot. We found this tech partner. Now we know that the budget is going to be X, and we think we're going to get a Y return. And I think that's really important because it allows for you to even inform yourself without building up the internal capacity that you might need as an organization to kind of run that technology. And it's an easy way to take a first step. And then you can put out a blog or you can put out content that informs the broader audience. There isn't as much conversation right now, I think, as we need to have around next-gen tech and how it's used and how it can be adopted and how it can't be when we talk about social issues. And we then, as a collective field, might spend a lot of resources and time chasing after the next app, chasing after the next blockchain solution before we kind of sit back and analyze collectively and say, well, how might this actually work and how might it not actually work?
Can you all talk to a little bit more about the partnerships and how you've been able to bring different groups to the table? I know Humanity United is doing a lot of that, Thorn with all the different tech partners you have, and of course you all with the different stakeholders kind of across the supply chain. How important is it to bring all those folks to the table and talk about how this technology is being implemented at the early stages versus trying to take it and say, okay, here's a solution we made for you, and now see if it works, right?
Super important. So Thorn is really lucky in that we sit in between tech companies and law enforcement and incredible nonprofits and government relations. So we do a lot of pivoting in our communications and in like our conversations that we have. But what that allows us to do is it allows us to hear the reality that people are experiencing, and that just like people within your companies who are like, the marketing team has different problems than your operations team. Like law enforcement has a different problem than the tech companies has a different problem than nonprofits. And so what that means is that we have the opportunity to hear and synthesize and build products that can support people where they are. And you can find ways by working really closely with people to understand what a solution can be. A quick example is that one of our big tools, Spotlight, is a tool available for free to all law enforcement in the US. It's in all 50 states. Anyone who's working on a human trafficking case can apply to use it. And the way that we built that tool, which is essentially, It brings in all the information from those 150,000 escort ads I told you about before, and it takes some big processing, and it essentially says, this is probably a child. This is probably someone under the control. This person looks like a missing kid that we saw before. So that's what that tool does, and it takes a law enforcement's job and just like makes it way easier. Instead of having to like Google for information, they're actually like logging into a dashboard where information is presented to them to like direct their caseload. But the way that we built that is we did a survey with survivors, and the way that we had the ability to even perform that survey was through a relationship with nonprofits who are direct service providers who are working with those survivors to say, well, what was your experience like? You know, what happened? How is technology a part of your abuse situation? And they told us they were writing their own ads. 2/3 of them, I believe, said that they had written their own ad at some point. And our hypothesis was, if a child is writing their own ad, don't you think that probably looks different than an adult writing their own ad? And the answer is like, most of the time, yeah. And so from that one insight, we were able to build a tool that was valuable, and that's like helping to find kids. So I think that's a good way to think about how are you taking insights that are very, very specific, that only you know and only you have access to, and building something that's going to empower other people to do their jobs better, or your own team to do their job better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a beautiful insight, and it speaks to kind of this idea that we in the tech community understand, which is user-centered design, right? But in this way, you're applying those principles to the issue that you're trying to address in similar ways. We have an investment fund called Working Capital, where we're investing in emerging technology startups that we feel can help address labor inequality issues around the world. One of those types of technology that we're looking at are worker communication platforms, right? So systems that allow for workers to directly communicate either with each other or potentially with a third party where exploitation might be happening. And so in that type of investment, what we would be looking for is an organization that understands the user audience and understands how to engage directly with the workers and make sure that there is a worker feedback loop that exists. Because otherwise you could build a technology or a product that isn't actually going to be effective or useful. And then within the fund itself, we actually, some of our limited partners are corporations. And the reason for that is that the tools that we're investing in, we want those tools to then be used and harnessed by the corporations themselves. And so having them in as a fund, as a limited partner on the fund, then gives us greater exposure to what tools they actually need to be more effective, ensuring that workers deep in their supply chain aren't being exploited or taken advantage of.
Yeah, similarly, partnerships are at the center of everything we do, from farm to shelf, whether that is at the farm and helping them find technical assistance or support in terms of investment management, and then all the way up the supply chain to help with sourcing and marketing and other types of activities. We're a smallish team of around 100 people, but we, as I mentioned, we work with over 1 million farmers and tens of thousands of products. And so it's really important for us to be leveraging those partnerships. And one of the things that is really important to us is identifying in a portfolio of 1,000 customers, finding a couple who are interested in, who have a really deep interest in piloting some new technologies. And so whether it's with some of the worker engagement tools like Humanity United is supporting, and working with partners in specific farms or specific factories to see, okay, one, does this provide value to the business? But two, does it provide value to the farmers and workers? Because again, user-centered design is at the core of everything we do. And one of the reasons our partnerships are so valuable is we can very quickly identify, okay, yes, this makes sense for these people, or no, this is way too much of a burden. It results in duplicative work. We need to look for another approach.
So we talked a little bit about the successes and how you guys have been able to have that success. What about the challenges, the pitfalls? Especially with next-gen technology, we don't necessarily know all of the implications of it on the outset, and we've seen that very recently, I think. How have you guys been able to navigate some of those things within your organizations?
Yeah, I mean, one is I consider, as the leader of our technology group, I consider at least half of my job to be an educator and to be an evangelist for this type of for these types of tools, and make sure that people in the organization at least understand them. I don't necessarily have to get them to embrace them, but they at least need to have a basic understanding of them and be able to connect the dots of how these tools can help them support their work. And I think another big part of my job is being an archaeologist and figuring out really specifically, okay, people across the organization, what have they been doing for the last several years? What's really important to them? What's at the core of their work? Because sometimes for people who aren't as connected to these types of emerging technologies, they're viewed as threats. And so really understanding where people are coming from and being able to frame these types of technologies as additive to their work as opposed to, okay, we're building you out of a job is really important.
Yeah, when we were talking, actually just before the panel, Bennett said something that was really beautiful. They said, like, technology is a tool so that people don't have to be tools. Like, we all have, right? He said that. And I really, really liked that. That's like really like resonating in my head right now, that part of the exciting part about all of these new tools and all of these new tools that are like, as layers of abstraction increase and you don't have to be able to like code directly, but you can use a tool to help increase your workflow or like automate your reports. Like, if you're not spending hours a day pulling a report, like, what is your brain free to think of, and how can you be free to move your mission forward? And you can take another meeting, you can sit on a panel, you can do another thing. But so for Thorn, because we're a tech company nonprofit, like, we're building products in-house. The way that the difficulty with new technology shows up for us is a little bit different in that it's all about, like, how do we push new technology insights into our products as quickly as possible without losing customer confidence. And I say customer, but it's for free. We're not charging for our tools. So it's all about how are you harnessing the newest information and providing it for our user base so that they can find kids faster without that muddying the results they're already used to seeing. So there's a certain like level of trust we have to put into our technology and that put into our products so that the law enforcement who are relying on our tools to do their jobs better aren't going to be like, ugh, another disruption to my day, but instead have it feel like a seamless process and say, oh, I really love the way you started moving these files around. It's so much more intuitive now. And so our problem is making sure that anything that we add is always intuitive to the user.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question, I think, for us to continue to reflect on. If I think about what is a good technology, what does it do, it naturally disrupts, right? And a lot of times, we don't know what the impact overall of that disruption is going to be. There's some positives and there's some negatives. And a lot of times, it might be hard to know what those negatives are. And we can only look back and say, oh, those are all the negative ways that this technology changed our behavior as a society. And I think we're seeing that right now in this moment today, right? I remember, 7, 8 years ago when the Arab Spring happened, and there was a lot of talk about social networks and the utilization of social networks to help fuel that revolution and help fuel and empower the advocates in the frontline organizations on the ground. Those same technologies now are being talked about in terms of how it perpetuates a cycle of abuse or how it perpetuates the false narratives that we see in the world today. And I think it's really important for us that are in this room and a part of this conversation to continue to reflect and try to be a little bit more proactive to predict how might these technologies that we're using or that we're using to disrupt society have a negative or downside. And it's hard sometimes, I think, as a business to want to invest in saying how might this be a bad thing for society, right? We want to say it's an externality. We want to put those downsides out of a box and say, well, it's not our responsibility to worry about that. But really, it fundamentally should be. If we're empowering the world with these new technologies, we need to think about the long-term implications of how these things are used and try to be a little bit more insightful as we're building to make sure that we're building for purpose.
And to what extent, then, do you think that outside of just a mission-based organization or nonprofit, that all corporations or all organizations need to start thinking about how their products impact the world or how their products are furthering social good? You know, Killian, you talked a little bit about it earlier with the investment aspect. And if you don't take that as a central piece, then you're going to be losing investment or you're going to be impacting the bottom line negatively. How are you guys seeing that sort of play out in the market?
Yeah. I mean, so we were having a conversation earlier. I thought it was really interesting. I think some of Sarah's insights and some of Thorn's insights potentially are better than some of the companies themselves, right? And so how, if you're a technology company and your platform is being used for ill or people are using it in ways that you don't intentionally think about it, how do you form really informative partnerships with those in the social good sector that might know more, if not, or as just as much as your internal teams? I think that's a really important thing because we constantly are thinking about technology similar to the companies, but from just a different vantage point, a different lens. And the more we can empower that dialogue amongst each other, I think the more effective we're going to know, and we can accelerate that ability to say, how might this technology actually be used in a negative way or have a downside for society?
And this is a place where I think like diversity and inclusion is really powerful in making your decisions and in thinking about the implications of new technology. Because the more the diversity of opinion that you have in the room, it's diversity of background and diversity of experience that'll say, you know, actually that sounds like it could have this effect on my day, which might be a totally different day than most people in the room. And if you don't have a diverse group of people talking about it, or to your question about partnerships, if you don't have a diverse group of partners thinking critically about a problem, you just miss a lot of opportunities on the table. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't even count the number of times a tech company has come to us and said, hey, we have a nonprofit discount, or you can use our tool pro bono. I can count the number of times they've said, hey, we want to develop a product. Will you help inform that? Will you be in part of the process early so we can figure out the constraints? The reason I can count it is because the number is 0. And so if, as companies are looking more towards how can their for-profit work generate a social good, one thing that I believe is critical is for them to bring the beneficiaries into the room really early into the process. And so otherwise, you end up in a situation where they come to me and they say, hey, we've got this great tool, we can see all the applications, and don't you want to use it? But there's just a fatal flaw in terms of, well, the farmers we work with a lot of times are illiterate, so we'd have to go back to square one and replace all text with pictograms. Or in a less dramatic example, our partners already have supply chain logistics products in place. And so are you expecting them to duplicate that and have redundant efforts for the sake of building your supply chain transparency product? Or have you thought about how they're going to seamlessly migrate their thousands of products and millions of transactions into this new system that they haven't yet explored? And so for us, it's really critical for partners for tech companies and even non-tech companies to bring us or the partners that we work with into the conversation early to help inform what it might look like. And then in terms of just overall business for social good, I think the end game for fair trade is to kind of put ourselves out of business. Eventually, ideally, every company is treating every person in their supply chain as their own employee. Those people are being treated fairly, are empowered to be good environmental stewards, and there's no need for a certification to prove that that's the case. But that's a long ways away.
Yeah. Do you guys feel similarly then? In a perfect world, is Thorn non-existent? You know, the chain non-existent kind of, and it's like those problems have been solved almost and move forward?
For me, absolutely. I've talked a little bit about domestic sex trafficking, but another one of our big focus areas is around child pornography, which is, in its technical term, child sexual abuse material. And so that's just hanging out on the internet. Like, you can just Google really terrible things, and like child's exploitation is then Googleable for the rest of their life. Or not necessarily on Google, but like you can easily find it. And so one of our big visions right now is like, what if we removed all that content from the internet? And like, what would that look like? And like, how much effort and how much collaboration and who needs to partner? And how do we help every organization and every company who's starting to have self-generated content? So whatever the new Instagram, whatever the new Twitter is, anywhere that you can upload content, I am 99.9% positive that there is child abuse material on that platform. But when a startup hangs out and they're trying to say, like, I'm just trying to like make ends meet, I'm trying to build something new, that's their vision, they're hopeful, they're excited, they're not thinking about how their platform is going to be used to abuse children. How can we build a role and how can we build products that support those companies so that they don't have to worry about that, because we already built the technology and they can just implement it. So like these type of visions of saying, how do we make it so it's so easy to take all of this vision and all of this work that like we do and our companies do and people before us have done, and how do we just simplify it so that everyone else can just pick it up and run with it? Because I do believe that if people were able to easily pick things up and run with them, they would. There's just so many things to pick up and it's so hard and it's so overwhelming. So like my vision would be that we can make it simple enough that everyone can just be like, of course I don't want that. And that they can move forward, that there's a system in place to support that vision.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Royce. And what I started thinking about is scale, right? This conversation of scale. And so if you're a nonprofit, a lot of funders will come to you and say, well, what's your vision of scale and how do you scale? But the question should be not how does your organization scale, but how does that solution scale, right? And so the more we can shift that towards us being irrelevant, us as in the nonprofit sector, really being the ones that incubate the ideas or start the ideas and then ideally hand those solutions off to others that then can get them to scale. That, I think, is a helpful organizing principle, at least in my mind, in terms of what is the role of us? Do we want to be relevant? Do we not want to be relevant? Ideally, we're not, but we currently are. And I don't think the solution is, or I don't think in the long term, the nonprofit sector disappears, but I think the ideas and maybe the impetus for us should be how do we create these things that do scale, but then we understand when it's our turn or time to exit and hand it off to somebody else who can bring it to scale.
Okay, awesome. I got one more question. I want to make sure we give enough time to open up to the audience as well. So if you guys have questions, I think we're going to use this mic up here. So you guys can probably go ahead and start lining up, I would say. Okay. How do you all measure the impact and quantify the impact of these things? Because I think one of the difficult things is if I'm looking at it from a nonprofit perspective at implementing a new technology, and it's like, all right, in 5 years, we want to do X. Is this actually going to help us? What are the tools that you guys use to actually, say, okay, we actually achieved that mission, or that was a successful pilot project or a successful experiment with this blockchain technology or AI technology?
Yeah, I mean, impact is, that's the big thing that everyone's grappling with right now. Impact's at the heart of what we do. We have an impact team that defines the metrics that we're seeking to improve across supply chains. And one of the things right now that we're grappling with is fair trade touches on so many different things. We touch on all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals in one way or another. And so identifying what you really want to measure and what's really important to measure and narrowing that down to just a few data points that everyone can easily understand is really difficult. When farmers are using the fair trade premium to build schools and also bring clean water to their villages and also build gender empowerment programs and also improve their organic implementation on their farm, it's really hard for us to come down to just a few data points. And so what we've been looking at doing, and it's also really difficult to find the data point that everybody cares about. Chances are across this room, everyone has different passions in terms of social good or social impact. And so one of the things that we're really focused on is how can we build an infrastructure that enables mass customization so that anyone can see information about what they care about. They can see that this one bag of coffee helped farmers in Uganda build a well, and this other bag of coffee helped farmers in Peru build a school, and they're more attached to education programs, and so they support that product. And so that's one of the big things that we're focusing on is, one, how can we trim down, instead of just taking the shotgun approach and say, all right, we're going to capture 300 data points and then we're going to figure out what's valuable, trim it down to what we think is most valuable, but then also do so in a way where people can choose what's most valuable to them and kind of curate their own experience as it relates to fair trade.
This is where I'm kind of jealous of those that are in the private sector, because your key performance indicators are very clear, right? It's like, is our business doing well? Are we hitting the bottom line? And here, to Bennett's point, there's a myriad of different ways that you can measure impact, and it really depends on what you're trying to address or how you're trying to look at it. And it's hard for us at times, right? So every one of our investments that we're doing through working capital, they're going to have different sets of indicators that we're looking at. They're also for-profit businesses, so they need to be profitable. So that's a very clear understanding of investing in startups is this thing scaling, i.e. is the market paying for the service that they're providing? That's pretty clear. But then the other harder one, obviously, is what is the impact that you're having? And that is going to vary from every individual investment that we're making to the work that I do with Know the Chain. The indicators that we're looking at for companies, it's 52 indicators, and no company is ever going to, in terms of the issues that we're looking at, want to have to manage 52 different indicators on how to address labor rights issues in their global supply chain. There's no corporation out there that I know of today that wants to have to internalize all of that, because a lot of those indicators are not actually going to directly translate to their bottom line. It translates to a better society, but not to their bottom line. And so it's this really difficult tension between how do we mainstream these measurements and get people to adopt them, also understanding that they're not going to align necessarily with their business interests or how they're defining what their business interests are.
For Thorn, ours is a little bit easier. Children identified. And so with our tools to date, we've identified 6,000 children. And if you include young adults, we're at 18,000. And so that drives our focus and what we're looking to do. but I'll share like an anecdote of one that's a little bit harder for us to quantify, just in the spirit of like difficult work. A different research program we did when we heard from every frontline person, every law enforcement, every tech company that we were working with, that there's this issue called sextortion that was being a really big issue. Everywhere we looked, there was no research on it, but everyone was saying sextortion, 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 which, and to define that for the group, it's the threat to reveal an intimate image in order to get you to do something. So like in adults, we just call this like blackmail. But with kids, and especially really young kids, you know, we're talking like 8, 12, 15, if they shared a maybe innocuous photo in our opinion, but someone who has power over them because they're older and pretending to be younger, or because they're just really cool in their school or in their community, says, I'm going to share this image, and then what happens to that individual who is now being blackmailed? So we decided to go and do a bunch of research on that, which was very cool, and we found that it's a big problem. We found out that like it's prevalent throughout the whole country, and we were figuring out what can we do to help these kids, and so we decided to run an awareness campaign, which we worked with Comrade on. And that awareness campaign, like, right, that's like a very hard thing. How are we making society a place where this doesn't happen to kids? That's very vague. And the way that we did it was we just tried to say, how many conversations have we started? And so like we have had around 4 million conversations that like teens have led around not shaming each other if a naked photo comes out of one of them, which is really interesting and really, really different. But we're trying to address the premise that like that hits on all of the things. So like it's shameful to be seen in any sexual way, but the person who pays for that is the victim, who like in our research, we saw 1 in 8 victims moved because of this abuse. Whole life change, can't live here anymore, have to move somewhere else. And so those kinds of like, this is what you're talking about, Killian, like what's this culture change? What's this community change? What do we need to do to have a better society? And so for those things, that's very hard, and we just count the number of people talking about it at the moment.
All right, I think we open up for questions. If we have some, it'd be great.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Hi, my name is Catalina. I am the founder of a nonprofit based in Colombia. We also work in technology for social good. My question is for Bennett, but anybody can answer, of course. And we also work with rural coffee growers, and we know how difficult for them is to access technology information. There's huge connectivity, like infrastructure issues, but also a lot of digital skills issues. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is how you're dealing with the infrastructure, connectivity, and knowledge, digital skills. So these people in rural areas connected to the fair trade value chain do have the knowledge, the skills, and the capabilities to connect with you, with the value chain, with your users, and especially knowing that according to a World Bank report 2 years ago, 60% of the world population is still offline. Mm-hmm. So we have a long way to go to make sure that everybody's connected.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that is foundational to our work. If you can't connect to the internet, then a lot of tech tools are not as useful. So in terms of bringing better connectivity to communities, that's something that we're seeking out partnerships with some larger companies that are working on those types of initiatives. So like Google's Project Loon, for example, where they're starting to pilot in countries that are really lacking connectivity. Another way that we solve that is ensuring that the tools that we're providing to farmers are highly usable offline and very easily sync when there is an opportunity to connect. So not expecting them to have the level of connectivity that we always have. And then finally, in terms of them bridging the divide between kind of tech savvy and holding a smartphone for the first time, that's where our user-centered design is really important. That's where doing research directly with coffee farmers and cocoa farmers is really important to figure out what are the barriers that we need to overcome and what can we do through visuals versus text and make it really intuitive, because things like as basic as like the hamburger menu icon that have become second nature to people who use tech every day, those 3 lines are totally meaningless to those who don't. And so those types of design considerations are really important as well.
Thank
you. Hi. Sorry. I want to start by saying congratulations on all the important and amazing work that you're doing. My question is really 2 parts. First, when you are developing all these technologies and you're operating in the spaces that you do you feel like there's a disconnect between you and larger organizations? You talked about working across the SDGs. Do you feel like you are able to take what you have and give it to the UN and they use it in a way that is effective? And do you feel like what you're doing is reaching policymakers? And then second, what would be the ideal platform for you to enable all of these technologies to scale up? Is there a space where those types of partnerships are offered to you to enable you to take your work from, not that it's here, but to take it to that next level of scalability? Thanks.
So with regards to the policy side of things, again, as a nonprofit with limited resources, we have to be very choosy about where we're deploying those resources. And so affecting policy has not been as much of a focus for us. That said, we still are in regular conversations with groups like the UN and the World Bank, since we do share missions. On the second part of the question, the big thing for me, I don't expect us ever to get the world on unified systems. But what I think we can do is have much better data interoperability. And so I'm a big fan of open data and specifically consistent data definitions. So if I'm describing a farm size in one way, let's make sure the World Bank is describing it in the same way as well, and that the UN is describing it in the same way. That way it doesn't matter if I use Salesforce and they use SAP and they use Oracle. As long as we're referring to data points in the same way and they're clearly defined and we're sharing access to them, then I think that's where we have a much better chance of kind of raising the tide together.
Yeah, one of the things, Thorn, when we were originally founded, we knew there was an intersection between technology and child sexual abuse, and we wanted to figure out what that is and accelerate solutions at that intersection. Our original theory of how we were going to operate was that we were going to research, identify the key partners who are in the space, and then we were going to like link them together and say, like, you guys go build it. We did that with a couple small projects. And then when we built the tool Spotlight that's being used for domestic sex trafficking victims, there was no one to take it. So we ended up taking all of that in-house and building it ourselves. And so I guess my answer to your question, the piece around like, can you give it to someone? Where's this place that it's happening? We found that there wasn't someone to give it to, and there wasn't this place that was happening, and so we built that space ourselves so that we could be the change we wanted to see. But I think there's I don't think there are a ton of spaces. I think there's a lot of growth potential right now to kind of like build those communities and build those spaces. And I really love your point about sharing terminology, because as we're growing rapidly, making sure that we can all talk to each other as we're growing is really, really important. So I'm into that.
Yeah, this is where I'm sometimes, again, jealous of the private sector. Because it's easy to get the private sector all on board with the same thing, because again, how well is your business performing? The market's really clear. Are you successful or not? In the NGO space, sometimes we create or recreate things because there isn't a market incentive for us to get on board at the same page. And so I think your point, Bennett, of same terminology, same systems is really important. And hopefully maybe the SDGs is the kind of thing that can be an organizing principle for both the private sector and the public sector and civil society to all try and get on the same page with common terminology, open data, these ways that we can all share it, because otherwise it's just on the data front, it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So it's all dependent upon making sure that you're measuring and communicating the same thing. And I think if we can do that, then the opportunities around machine learning then open up more, rather than us all talking about machine learning being a useful aspect or organizing principle for good. Well, if we're not all reading the same thing or analyzing the same thing or measuring in the same way, it's not going to be that effective. And so I think, yeah, there is a platform for large global institutions like the UN and others to organize and really try and force us all to have the same conversation, because I think, that's a fair argument against civil society is that we're not always on the same page. And we're not always on the same page because of ideological differences. No, sometimes the ideologies are the same. It's just we have this inherent human incentive to say, no, we're doing it different. It's like, no, we're really not. So let's all just own that and come together and say, how do we work together on it?
Hello, guys. My name is Toby Attal. I founded a company called Doodle the News at Syracuse, where I go for my master's. And my question's to Bennett Wetch, but obviously to all you guys. You mentioned how you should like reach out to beneficiaries first before you try to scale up a for-profit business. I guess I want to ask, how do you leverage those partnerships that you may or may not be able to accumulate in order to get to a next level in your business?
So are you speaking from the perspective of the for-profit side?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think one of the things that you want to look at is who are the people that you're ultimately trying to reach or trying to impact, and then be very selective about partnering with nonprofits or partnering with NGOs who have a very targeted mission to support them as well. Again, I think it can be really, it can be a trap for some companies to say, okay, I can see how my product could serve exploited children and serve underserved farmers and serve all these other different populations, so I'm going to talk to everybody. And you can either be kind of something to everyone or everything to someone. And so for me, it's really about finding what are those populations that we have a big crossover on, and then bringing people in with the very clear understanding that you brought them into the room to leverage their expertise versus you brought them into the room as a potential future client that can help build your portfolio.
Awesome. I'd be curious to hear, Killian, how you guys are working capital or thinking about that, because you're bringing in some of the for-profit companies at the early stages to validate the technology and be a partner in creating that. So how are you guys thinking about that with the fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think increasingly there's this understanding, and it's a normative shift, that corporations have greater responsibility in their supply chains than I think they really wanted to own. And we see that with Know the Chain in terms of our evaluation, but I think another great proof point of that is within working capital, where these major corporations have come in as limited partners because they say, look, the existing tools that are out there in the market are just not at scale, or they're not sufficient for us to be able to really deploy. And so bringing them in, it does help us validate, but then being able to invest in technology companies because we are experts on these issues to say, well, are these products actually coming from a basis of being informed by the population that they're intended to serve? And so it's a really interesting hybrid model where we can say, okay, there's market validation because the corporations are saying we need these tools, and we can have a better sense of what the market looks like, and we also have a better sense of what tools can be effective to drive change. And so trying to figure out creative ways to merge the two together to bring the market closer to the problem and also bring the problem closer to those that are going to need to address it is really an important aspect to it.
Thank you.
Hey there. I'm coming from the perspective of working for an agency that is for-profit but helps nonprofits and for benefits leverage their capacity for data culture and their technological proficiency. And I'm curious, to your point, Bennett, you mentioned having this sort of common language that we're all using across the sector. And from both the perspective of internal within the organization having that same language, and across organizations, since you all represent, kind of a diverse array of working in NGOs and social impact, if what you have found to be the most effective way of reporting up within your organizations on the KPIs that you're measuring and the success. And I'm curious to see if any of those best practices overlap between your three organizations.
Yeah, in terms of reporting up, a big part of what I'm trying to help our organization embrace is no matter what the meeting is, there's probably a data point that would help better inform that meeting. And so one of the things that we're working on is as we go into a meeting and as you're setting an agenda and as our senior leaders are having discussions, set the expectation that the people that report to them or even themselves are coming to the meeting with a data point in mind. Whether that is, okay, we've got this new partnership, how many farmers do we believe that will impact? Or how many hectares of land do we believe will fall under protection as a result of this? And so a big part of it is, a lot of it is a culture change to a more data-driven culture, and that expectation of there should be data inside of these conversations as opposed to you should be generating data as an output of your work and it's something that the rest of the world cares about, but meanwhile we're having these more ethereal strategic conversations that aren't as grounded in, okay, well, can we actually measure this and can we measure our change?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of our conversations are very data-driven, and it's very about what's the potential impact of that for our product specifically? Is that engaging our users? Is it not? What's the uptime on the product? What's the delay on the, it's a lot of like, what is the potential impact for an investigator's ability to do their job? It was like very much kind of like the nitty gritty of it. And then at a higher level, if we're having more ethereal conversations, like there's sort of two levels. One level is saying like, is there something we could do that would elevate all efforts of the organization? And like what is that? And like why would that elevate it? And just sort of trying to like name all the whys and spending a lot less time talking about the like vision and mission and being like kind of like onboarding everyone. Like we get the mission, we get the vision, and spending like once, twice a year, like really sitting down as a team to talk about like, do we need to pivot in any way? But kind of like letting that mission vision live and stay and sit, and like executive team can like figure out if that needs to pivot. But the whole rest of the team is just thinking about how their efforts can support that and push it forward is similar to what you're saying, but that's how we talk about our problems and our opportunities internally.
And thinking about how to respond to this question, I think for me, in the work that I predominantly spend my time doing with Know the Chain is we're evaluating companies and we're giving a score to those companies to say, you're 10 out of 20 or you're 90 out of 100. And so a lot of those conversations then is externally focused, right? So I can go into a conversation with leadership of a company. I can say, look, you're underperforming when it comes to labor voices or when it comes to recruitment issues and making sure that workers aren't exploited in the recruitment process. And so it focuses the mind and it focuses the conversation into then being able to say, how am I using this data to allow for that dialogue to happen, to focus where efforts aren't happening that need to happen. Because otherwise, I can go into a conversation, I can talk hypothetically to a company or to their leadership about, you need to do more to make sure that workers are protected, or you need to do more because you're not doing enough on recruitment, and they can say, well, we have this policy, or we're taking these steps, or we have these partnerships, and the conversation then is unstructured, where now we're using data to structure that dialogue and say, this is how you're performing, and this is what you need to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think one of the good outcomes of that is it will immediately highlight where you have gaps in your data model.
Yeah.
And so if you start bringing that mentality to those types of conversations, it's going to become immediately apparent that, oh, wow, we don't have that data point in half of our portfolio, and we need to figure that out. Or, wow, we don't agree on the definition of even what a farmer is. And you might think that it's someone who owns their own land versus someone else might think it's someone who has hired labor on someone else's land. And so by focusing on those key data points at that level, it will make it very clear where there's gaps in your model, and it makes it a lot easier to target what you should improve on.
Thank you.
Well, my name is Max. Thank you, first of all. Very useful. I'm the co-founder of a startup based here in Austin. It's called Open Currents, and we're developing an alternative currency that's generated by social action. So we're enabling nonprofits to reward their volunteers with a digital currency and build a marketplace of companies that want to value time that people are giving to the greater good as a way to connect with customers and even receive tax deductions for doing so. And we've had this problem of trying to find like an easy way or a platform where basically grassroots nonprofits list their KPIs or their achievements and how you could just easily scroll and sort of like measure success on what they're doing. And it seems to be the information is very scattered around, and I'm wondering if you guys know of one platform or some efforts they're trying to synthesize that and give the information easily to the end customer.
I don't know of one platform for like all of, I think like things like Charity Navigator try and identify that, like, or like donors choose, things that are like trying to help donors understand where their money goes to a nonprofit. But every organization has their own KPIs and has their own vision of impact and has their own definition of it, which is why there's like such an investment in like impact reports that live in like PDFs on like someone's website. But like that's where the majority of that information lives, in my experience. I don't know if you guys have like something more hopeful to say there.
I've talked to a few different startups that are working on doing that, but they have yet to reach much critical mass, and so the value of their data set is not really there yet. But it is certainly becoming more of a focus. I can definitely, their names escape me right now, but I can look them up afterwards and share that with you. But there are several startups that are focusing on what are some common data points that we could identify, such as pounds of CO2 or areas of land that are just very kind of standard units of measure, and then figuring out how might that apply to a corporation like Target versus a nonprofit like Fair Trade. And so it's becoming something that is of increasing interest to people, but I'm not aware of anything that has critical mass yet.
Thank you. And I think you can learn a lot from looking at groups like Kiva, Give
Yeah.
Directly, Donors Choose, these organizations individually that have developed out a more sophisticated model that ties giving directly to impact. And I think those are just great models. I'll also say I don't think we in the foundation space have done a good job of, or in many ways have perpetuated this idea of you need to report back to us as the ones that are giving the funds in a way that aligns with our strategic vision of how the world needs to change. And so I think the challenge there then becomes you get all these reporting frameworks and all these different understandings of measurement because a lot of the organizations are responding to the person that gave them the money, what their expectations are. And so I think this conversation about data and measurement and impact is really important to have, and that's why, in my mind, I look to those groups like Kiva, Give Directly, Donors Choose, and their effectiveness of really getting a significant amount of funds from individuals who want to see how their money is directly tied to impact.
Thank you. One last question I have for you all as we kind of look to wrap up here and tie it back to the theme of the day, which is really how do we move fast? And I think the cliche in tech is move fast and break things, but it's like how to move fast and fix things, right? How do you, we've seen a lot that from idea to kind of product in the market, it's like a year, 2 years or more. How do you avoid that situation and get stuff, whether it's new technology or new processes, et cetera, so that it's not 5 years from now that we actually see the impact, but we start to accelerate those timelines?
I think a big thing that we've touched on, like in a myriad of ways, is like internal communication. What is your ability to make a decision internally? Just like any decision. And if you have the ability to say, this is important, how long does it take for everyone to agree that it's important? And then how quickly before you can start working? So like for us, like a turnaround on our sextortion campaign, which is a thing we had not done a public awareness campaign before, but we thought it was important. We did the research on its own, and then it took us like 4 months. And then okay, great, now we're doing more with it. So I think that was completely based on our ability internally. One, we're small, we're 20 people. So we can just call our boss and say, I'm passionate about this, I'm doing this, and then you can run with it. But it's when you're a large organization, how do you make sure that you are creating and taking space so that you can say, I'm passionate and here's a solution, let me have 3 months to go fix something, and building that culture to say, it's okay to try something, let's validate it, like you were saying earlier, and then validate, build.
Yeah, just thinking about reflecting on that question is, how do we look at the moment that we're in right now and the conversations that are happening around tech and impact on society, and how do we try to internalize that as a world, really, to say it's really important for us to not only think about how we move fast and break things, but how do we move fast and break less, break less in society, and really capitalize on this opportunity and try to have more companies internalize as they're growing these considerations so that we are having to work less to fix the problems that we're creating through this disruption.
Yeah, for me, one really important aspect of being able to move pretty nimbly and quickly is recognizing that you're never going to be perfect. And so often there's an expectation of, okay, well, we can't launch this until it's perfect. I mean, we've got big partners, and we've got lots of farmers who depend on us, and unless it's perfect, we shouldn't launch it. But then it takes you 2, 3, 4 years to perfect it, and then that technology is out of date. And so I think one is perfect is the enemy of good. So let's figure out what's good enough and then get that out there, learn from it via user-centered design principles, and then improve upon it. And then the other thing that is really important for our organization is that old African proverb of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And what we're finding now is you've got to find a sweet spot between those two. And you got to make sure that, like you said, great internal communication, make sure everyone's on board. Because it would be really easy for our technology team to just go heads down and be like, all right, we're going to implement this solution. And then go tell our colleagues across the organization, hey, look at this, isn't it great? And recognize, oh no, there are fatal flaws throughout this. So for us, a lot of it is about that internal communication, and then also being willing to put something out that we know isn't perfect, but we know is better than the current reality.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming today. Hopefully it was very interesting. I think we're going to be hanging around here for a little bit and across the lounge. If you guys have further questions, feel free to come up and say hello. But